In our last episode, we talked about energy transition and how climate adaptation really means business transformation for some sectors. And we're following in a similar vein today. We'll be talking with Glenn Anderson about sustainable agriculture and conservation. We're going to be drawing on Glenn's insights from biodiversity net gain, carbon offsets, and nutrient neutrality projects delivered through an exemplar project near Norfolk in the UK. Glenn's a landowner and project leader at the Wendling Beck Environmental Project. He has over 20 years of experience in conservation and in farming and agriculture. The project actually includes 4 farms, 3 sites of special scientific interest, an ancient woodland, and is in partnership with local authorities, wildlife trusts, rivers trusts, and other commercial operators. So please welcome Glenn. Normally, when we start with these, we start with an overview of the organisation, the context for sustainability. And today is no different. We're going to be talking about sustainable agriculture, but it overlaps with many themes. So it's probably worth asking Glenn, what are the pressures you see influencing modern day farming and how do they relate to conservation?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so there's a huge change coming up within agriculture in the UK. I think from the 50s, really, we've been on a gradual increased trend of intensification, and that's come at a bit of a cost in terms of the environment. So we're seeing a loss of biodiversity across the landscape. So right from, the impact of insecticides and synthetic inputs, and I've been part of that process over the last 20 odd years. So I'm just starting to really understand the true impact of conventional intensive arable farming particularly. And I think as we sort of head forward to the future, there really needs to be more balance in the system. And I think we're seeing that with a lot of policy changes that are coming through. So we've obviously come out of Europe now. Whatever the rights and wrongs of that, we are heading towards a loss of that basic payment scheme. So that subsidy regime that farming has seen since the war, and that's a big change for us. It takes away that kind of security blanket. We see that subsidies are the kind of the mechanism that underwrites the risk of production, if you will. So they're the thing that says, well, we've lost some money on the farm this year, but we're still going to grow something next year. And without them in place, we need to look for other ways to become more financially resilient, but at the same time become more environmentally resilient. And I think that's the path that most landowners are now taking, and are kind of faced with this, a bit of a crossroads that we need to be doing things differently. We've got a net zero ambition within this country that we need to meet. Farming, because it's so land-based, is probably one of the only industries that has the ability to actually help reverse biodiversity loss and store more carbon within the land. So we're in a unique position there, and that gives us opportunities both from a financial perspective, but also within the environment as well.
Epic. And there's a lot to unpack there. So at the highest level, it's kind of productivity is going to need to adapt at some stage. Government policy is changing. There are new market opportunities. And then on top of that, climate and environmental conditions. All those factors mean that we need to just do things in a different way. But let me take you back. If you didn't do anything, what would happen?
Well, we're on particularly light land here in Norfolk. So we're not on prime arable land. We're on sort of grade 3 and 4 land. It's very sandy. And we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. And that's part of the rationale for doing this project. Is we'd noticed an increase in extreme weather events, particularly drought we suffer from badly. And we don't have enough water to irrigate crops, kind of a mass scale within these landholdings. So, with the onset of climate change, we would be in real trouble trying to farm conventionally in the way that we always have. So it's just not sustainable to carry on like that. We feel as a group of farmers and landowners that actually climate change is the biggest threat to food security to us as a country, and we need to rebalance that. We need to start to look at the root cause of that And we're also in the position where we can do something about that because of we've got land use under our control. So how do we use the land differently to insulate the effects of climate change and biodiversity loss, and actually give ourselves a fighting chance of becoming more sustainable going forward?
And this is where you showed a couple of slides with us. I think, Amarjeet, if you could bring up the first one, which is what the project looks like today or a few years ago, and then we'll jump from that one in terms of what it looks like right now, or what it looked like if you not that one. That's the punchline if you go back to great this one. So just talk us through what we're looking at here, Glenn.
This is a baseline of May 2021, Stephen. So it's going back a few years before we actually started the project. And you can see the map in the top left-hand corner is actually a UK map, a UK HAB map, which is the metric that we use to classify the types of habitat that are on the ground at any particular given point in time. And the orange on there actually represents arable. So you can see you've got a green spine down the middle, which is the river corridor. That's the Wendling Beck River, which is where the project gets its name from. It flows south to north. You can just make out the white blob down the middle is the Anglian Water Recycling Centre, serving the town of Dereham, which is just to the south and the right on there, about 26,000 people. And that's pretty much how it's always been. It's actually less intense than it used to be. If you go back to the 80s, I've got a great aerial photograph of this farm in the 80s and this landholding, and it was every square inch of it was in some form of wheat or barley production at that point. So it's a bit less intense than it used to be, but it's still pretty intense. And not all of that land is actually fit for arable production. Very little of it is what you would call good land. And we've been working like that for the last few decades. And the path, if you flick forward to the next slide, shows you the transition that we're looking to take. So this is a kind of a future map, a future lens, and you can see that it's become a more wild landscape, much more embedded with habitat creation and nature restoration, but actually still working to deliver some food and continue that story of food production within it. So this isn't rewilding, this is managed conservation. We think that rewilding actually exists on a bit of a spectrum. And we're sort of on the lower part of that spectrum, so it will become a much wilder landscape. But we're really managing nature and conservation, and there's a few mechanisms that underline that, and that's the reason we're doing it that way, which we can come on to. If you look at the map in the top left-hand corner, you can see that it's changed colour. So we still have the green spine, but instead of orange, we're a mix of different colours, quite dominated by the dark and light yellows. And this represents a change in the type of habitats we're creating. So it becomes much more grass-based, but looking for high distinctiveness grasslands. So lowland meadow is a really important high distinctive habitat type within the UK. We've actually lost 99% of our lowland meadows since the 1950s, generally been ploughed up and turned into arable production. But that's where you see these kind of species-rich, wildflower meadows managed in a traditional way with a hay cut and an aftermath graze. So really, we're looking to go backwards in some regards to the way that the land used to be farmed and used, a bit less intensive, but really working for nature and creating a biodiversity uplift in that process, which potentially gives us the ability to monetize that as well.
Wonderful. And this is more than one farm, isn't it? This is 4 farms. So what was the rationale there? What's the importance of scale in this program? So
yeah, this is 4 farmers coming together. We've also got Norfolk Wildlife Trust and Norfolk County Council as landowners in the project. And if you go back to 2010, there was a report done called the Making Space for Nature report, which really demonstrated that actually nature really thrives at scale. So the mantra that came out of that report was bigger, better, more enjoined. And it articulated and was evidence-based that actually you need a critical mass and you need to get ecosystems working at a certain level of scale to make them functional and make them really work for species. So if you look at that map in the top left, what you're seeing there is a really broad range of different habitat types, a diverse range of, different mosaic of habitats within there. So you've got lowland heath, lowland meadow, floodplain wetland mosaic, connective woodland blocks. And if you think about it, on the ground, that's really enables a landscape to allow different species to really thrive. And that's really the measure of this. So we always work in kind of habitat terms, with the assumption that if you create the habitat, the species will come. But whenever we get to measuring these projects, it always goes back down to a species level. So, as we're working with different organisations and different techs, including AI Dash, really we're looking at how we can measure the uplift of species through the habitat that we're creating.
Classic. Hamajit, I think we're okay with the slides for now. If you can take those off. But let's talk a little bit about, with so many different owners, if you like, of the land. If you could just turn the slides off so I can see Glenn again. We'll come to this when you kind of jump to some of the punchline here on the numbers. But can you say a little bit more about how you set yourselves up to manage across different landowners effectively?
Yeah, so that's quite complex. I think farming historically is quite an isolated profession in some ways. So farmers don't traditionally collaborate that well. We're seeing much more of it coming forward now with farm clusters and the like, where farmers are starting to talk more and share ideas and even kind of machinery and techniques and things around how they're managing land. But we really needed to get to a point where we could deliver this kind of critical mass, and to be able to do that, we obviously needed to collaborate with our neighbours. So that's a kind of a gradual process. Fortunately, we've got some neighbours that, through conversation, it transpired that we were really quite aligned in our outlook. We were ready to do something different, but there's lots of technical issues around that behind the scenes. So we have created an operating company now. It is a limited liability partnership, and again, the corporate structure to manage these projects is quite tricky. We've got 2 limited companies, 2 partnerships, one of which is an investment company, and that's really difficult. So it affects tax, it affects lots of different sort of landowner positions within there that we've had to work with the lawyers quite closely with over quite a long period of time to deliver a model that suits everybody. And we're now helping other projects with that process as well, where we're starting to look at the right type of corporate vehicles, and everybody's different, to be honest. So the bigger the group of farmers, the more of an umbrella company that needs to be there. The tighter knit that group of farmer, the more it can resemble a kind of a traditional kind of corporate structure, which might actually end up trading environmental credits and that sort of thing.
So you kind of set it up as a separate business where the investors, the landowners, are kind of shareholders of that company, and then presumably other investors can pay for stuff as well, and then obviously you can trade from that collective.
Yeah, so we need a corporate vehicle which can do lots of things. So it needs to be able to take revenue and sell environmental credits. It also needs to be able to manage the project and deliver the setup of the project. So capital works, creation of these different habitats, a central conduit to be able to do everything within the project, and generate some returns for the landowners in the process. So the corporate structure is owned by the landowners. It makes a kind of a license payment back to the landowners to be able to use the land, but it's really the central operating company that's managing that land for the long term. And these are obviously long-term contracts. It's things like biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality. So BNG is a 30-year agreement. Nutrient neutrality is a 125-year agreement. This goes beyond our tenure. So to create a vehicle which will stand the test of time, will allow flexibility for successive landowners, could be future generations of our families that are dealing with this. We don't want to get to year 30 and then plough up a nature-rich environment. We need to deliver a business model which will be there in perpetuity. So that's taken a huge amount of thought, some quite difficult negotiation at times, but we're there now. We're kind of market ready, and the lawyers have done a great job.
Thank you. And we've had this slide up for quite a while now, so we may as well touch on some of the bottom line numbers, the commercial numbers here. But could you just walk us through what's on here? So I know it's the waterfall diagram of some of the financials of the project.
So this was a slide that was actually put together for us by the European Investment Bank. So they came in and did a case study on the project and then kind of interrogated our finance model and some of the numbers that we were looking at. And to just give you a bit of background to this, our finance model is a 125-year model. It looks at multiple different aspects of this project, including tax. It looks at all of the capital contributions, the ongoing cost of management, re-injection of capital in future years, insurance, assurance. It's really a very, very detailed spreadsheet that extends to kind of many thousands of lines across an Excel spreadsheet. But once you boil all that down, there's some kind of broad principles within it. So we measure the natural capital elements as well, which we want to value, but we don't necessarily ever create a revenue out of. So you can see some of the elements of this, like air quality and recreation, physical health. They're costs that we start to calculate through that natural capital accounting process as wider society benefits, and that's where we can start to articulate additionality that the project creates. But we're not physically looking to generate any revenue from that. It's all kind of co-benefits. Yeah. We then have a series of costs, and the costs include the loss of the farming income, subsidies, agri-environment schemes, and such like that we've got at the moment. But then all the capital costs of the project, so fencing, flower seed. We're going to need to invest in an in-house livestock unit at some point once we've got a critical mass. All of the costs of long-term management. So we've worked quite closely with the Wildlife Trust because that's what they do as an organisation. So they've got some really good data on that. We've delivered about 200 acres out of the 2,000 acres within this project, stretching across about 7 or 8 different habitat types. And we've done that quite recently. So we've got some really up-to-date cost data. We start to layer in the inflation, and there's some methodologies for allowing for inflation within that. When we started this project 3 years ago, inflation was 2% across the board, and now we're sort of faced with sort of 7, 8, 9, 10% inflation, which we never would have considered a few years ago. So that's been built into the model as well. All of the red lines indicate the overall costs, including the loss of the opportunity costs, if you will. And then the blue costs are layering back in the revenue that the project will create. So the waterfall diagram shows us getting down to a kind of a minus figure, and then we start to build the revenues from that point forward. And you can see that actually over a 30-year period, roughly, we're almost €1 million. It was done in euros because it was a European Investment Bank. Better off as a collective of landowners per year. So when we talk about building financial resilience into the businesses, that's exactly what this is demonstrating, that this is actually an investable proposition. It pays better in our view than the status quo of farming it within our context. And I will caveat that because actually, we're not the most profitable arable farms on the type of land that we've got in our current situation. So this works much better for us financially as we go forward, but it's also building huge amounts of resilience into climate and biodiversity as we go.
And we can probably lose the slides now, Amajit, if you can turn them off. Thank you. But what would have been the case? I know you said £1 million better off if you didn't do. Sorry, you're £1 million better off because of the project. What are the kind of key things that you've taken away from this in terms of looking at the model, which you can probably transfer the insights to other farmers, other landowners, which probably, seeing the same headwinds that you saw a few years back?
Yeah, so we're working on this at the moment. So as part of this process, it's become kind of all consuming. And I don't think we ever would have seen that at the outset. We never set out to kind of become an exemplar project. We just wanted to do something on our patch within our land holdings. But as we've gone through this process and we've become a bit of a pathfinder project and overcome to some extent some of the challenges in front of us and really got ahead around this kind of emerging policy environment, we've built a level of expertise just by going through the process. And that's seen quite a lot of interest from other landowners asking us to help them take a similar approach. So we've now formally sort of started doing that. We're spending all of our time on this now. So we're actually consulting with other projects, mainly in the eastern region around where we are. And that's slightly different for each project. So what we've found is that actually the broad step change process doesn't really vary between projects. We take the same approach, whether it's a single landowner or a collaboration and multiple different landowners coming together. That step change process, the way that you start to look at the opportunities in the landscape, the opportunities for ecosystem services, how you approach those, how you model those, understanding the market, build up the kind of the opportunity mapping within the land holdings. That's a similar process. What varies massively between projects is the underlying natural capital and the opportunities that those projects have. So we're fortunate in some ways that we're in a nutrient neutrality zone now within Norfolk. We didn't have that at the start of the project. That's a relatively new thing within the last 12 months. The project was originally built around biodiversity net gain. We're now working really hard on nutrient neutrality to come up with interventions for that. We've got some guidance now from DEFRA on the stacking and bundling rules. We know that we can stack BNG and nutrient neutrality, which is helpful to us. We had done quite a lot of work at the beginning around carbon, both above ground and below ground. We've baselined that. We will measure it going forward. Carbon isn't a massive opportunity for this project because we're limited on the additionality under the new stacking rules. That's fine. We still want to measure it. There's the possibility that some of those rules will change over time as government and the practitioners get their heads around these kind of nature markets. So we're finding a big interest from other landowners. We're aware and advising on projects that total around 300,000 acres. That's a lot of land, and it doesn't mean that everybody's looking to take all of the land out of production. These projects vary. Some are more ambitious in nature terms than others. Some are really quite cleverly looking at how you integrate nature corridors within a farm system as well. So it's not one size fits all. It really does vary. But our job, I guess, is to understand the opportunities within the landscape and understand the best places for nature. And I think that's one of the nuances of this. And I think we probably understand that better than some, simply because we are farmers and we're doing it day in, day out. We're actually delivering habitats on the ground with the onset of climate change. So we had a big drought last year, which was a nightmare from an establishment point of view. We understand about, how you actually create these habitats. We understand the farmer nuances around tax, around succession, around, what that means to the existing production system, how you go about taking land out of production within what is within farming quite an intense routine of production. Got to get drilled, got to get cultivated, got to get harvested. Farmers don't really have the opportunity to kind of sit back and think, well, how am I going to reinvent my business to take advantage of some of these new opportunities? We can help people with that process because we've been through it. So that's what we're doing now. Yeah, and we hope we can drive forward nature recovery as part of that process.
And I guess when I've spoken to other farms as well, some of the questions they come back is, what about food? What about food production? So in this case, you mentioned stacking of biodiversity credits with carbon and nutrient neutrality. But actually what strikes me about this project as well, and I'd love to, if you could dig in a little bit more about the transition to horticulture and how that links in with carbon, and likewise the grasslands and the introduction of cattle. So it's not one in absence of everything else. It is actually, there's a stacking here of food production, different food production, granted, but still with those conservation opportunities?
No, it's a really good question. It's an important question. I see Olivia's just put a question in the chat along similar lines, saying what's the difference in the crop output after these interventions? And it's really a completely different system. So if we unpack that and look at what we're doing at the moment, so we're producing mainly cereal crops, so seeds and pulses, grains and pulses, which predominantly go into livestock feed. That's where most of that ends up. So within the UK, 60% of the cereals actually go into livestock feed, which is that's quite a big percentage. And actually that's quite a carbon hungry process going down that route. It's quite efficient, but it's quite carbon hungry. We're not super efficient at growing those kind of crops on this land. We can move to a grass-based system. We can have livestock on the project area managing those habitats in a much more gentle, sort of sustainable manner, and still contribute to that food production story. So we won't get to the calorific value of intensive cereal production, but we're still contributing to food production. We've got about 150, 160 acres of blackcurrants today, which are grown for Ribena, owned by Suntory, and they're transitioning over to a regenerative system. So they've gone from conventional to regen, which is all about working with the soils and working with nature to try and get the life back in the soil, so that you need less synthetic inputs as part of that process. And that's a soil food web process where we're really looking at the microbiology of the soil, understanding exactly what's lacking, and the soil degradation is quite severe today through years and years of seed dressings and ag chems and synthetic fertilizers. So we need to try and reinvigorate that. We're doing that through a composting process, actually analysing that. So Rosie, who's one of the landowners, got all the microscopes set up. She's a consultant level soil food web technician now. I'm working to create compost which actually goes on as a drench and a tea to put billions of bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi back in the soils. And as we're doing this, we're measuring what's happening. So we've already seen about a 25 to 27% carbon increase within the soil on the regen system with the blackcurrants over a 7-year period. That's working with the University of East Anglia, so they're monitoring that. It's a PhD program that's happening, and they're really looking at how we lock in stable soil carbon, and that's really important. Carbon's a big opportunity within farming. So as we transition to these new markets, we know that farming is one of the only industry where you can actually sequester carbon and store it within the soil, but you need to do that in a way that has permanence. And without going into too much detail, every time you turn over the soil, you're releasing an element of that labile carbon within the soil. So that regen approach, without the turning the soil over and releasing that carbon, is a much better practice from a carbon perspective. So, and we're seeing if you look at the numbers of people that went to Groundswell this year, we're seeing quite a big interest in that within the agricultural sector as well. So that's important, but actually data is really king in this. So we need to be measuring everything we're doing. As these projects become investable and start to be monetized, people are really buying the data from this. So as we go down that pathway, it's all about data capture, how you're storing that data, how you make it usable, how you make it accessible. And I guess you guys are a key part of that process, and you're looking at that as well with what you do as an organization. But yeah, that's food production, that whole food security debate is a big one. We've got hyperinflation in food prices over the last year, which is quite unhelpful. A lot of that is actually caused by outside factors, Ukraine and such like. I think we really need to unpack where we are as a nation within food production terms, and it's always really seen as a negative in the press that you'll hear that we've gone from 70% self-sufficiency in the 80s down to 60% today, but that's actually quite a misleading statistic. That 60% figure is actually all the food that goes through the supermarket. So it's your avocado, your out-of-season veg, your bananas, things that we can't grow in this country. If you look at indigenous food production in the UK, things that we can grow within a ever-changing climate, we're about 70% today. So that hasn't really changed over those intervening decades. But if you think about what's happened on the ground, and I go back to my 1980s aerial photo with wall-to-wall wheat, we've got hugely different land use now. So the indigenous food supply hasn't changed, but we've got thousands of hectares of solar panels, biocrops in the form of rye and maize, which are going into biodigesters. We've got hundreds of thousand acres of agri-environment in the mix that wasn't there in the 80s. So actually, I think we've done quite well over the last few decades in using the land, more intensively in some ways, but actually using it to do more than just grow food. And I think that's something that we need to go forward with in the future. It's not just about food production. The land needs to work harder to also deliver for the climate and deliver for biodiversity and deliver, high quality, safe, healthy food for the nation as well.
So food and carbon work. And then that nicely takes us into biodiversity as well. But I know that, let me ask you, you've done quite a number of projects now on biodiversity on the site. I'm keen to get your views on two things. Firstly, I guess, what's the process? How do you make it happen in reality? And then is there any outstanding challenges? And then again, coming back to, I guess, a secondary question that if you're a farmer, where do you see the opportunities? Is it about turning the cereal crop into a grassland? Is it, and then with cattle, which is kind of where we've gone on Wendling Beck? I've heard from some it's the hedgerows and enhancements. It's not really affecting food production at all. It's just the margins of the field which are gaining some traction. But let's start with the first one, which is, what's the process been like for you? The operating company, what do you need to put in place to actually sell a credit?
Yeah, and we've been working on this, in an ever-shifting policy environment over the last few years. So it's been quite a challenge from that point of view, but we are really getting there now. So the principal mechanism for us is biodiversity net gain. So for anybody that's not aware, this is the idea that actually, as you develop land, there is an uplift in value of that land. So if you get planning permission to build houses, or it's a construction project or minerals or whatever it is, there's an amount of profit, and quite good profit, within that process. But actually, you lose habitat as part of that process as well, and that habitat doesn't necessarily belong, and the benefits of that habitat doesn't necessarily belong to the landowner. That's something that affects wider society. So the overarching principle is to the developers that if you're actually going to lose that habitat as part of that process, which you're making good money on, then the least you can do is reset that habitat somewhere else. And actually, while you're at it, we can provide a minimum of 10% net gain. So that's how net gain policy works. You can do that by creating features on site to offset that habitat, or you can buy credits from off-site providers. And Wendling Beck is an example of an off-site habitat provider for BNG. So the way that works is that you take a baseline. You need to know what you've got at the moment and what that habitat condition is. And we use a metric called UK-HAB to do that. And that gives us a condition score and a type of habitat across the board. And that's our baseline. So baselining is key on this. Whether it's biodiversity net gain, whether it's carbon, it doesn't really matter. We need to understand what's there at the moment, because you can't sell what you've got. You can only sell an uplift in what you're going to provide. So if we take an arable field, which scores quite lowly as a biodiversity, in biodiversity terms within UK-HAB, because it's constantly moved, it's got potentially ag chems applied to it and that sort of stuff, that has a score. And I think within the DEFRA metric, which is the piece of information that governs all this, it's about 2 units per hectare. If we take that and create a really high distinctiveness grassland like Lowland Meadow, then that will give us an uplift of 4 or 5 units per hectare as part of that process. And those biodiversity units, as we call them, are actually monetized. So we can sell those to developers as they're looking for offsets, and they have a value to us. So we're really sort of farming nature in that way. we have to take that money. It's mainly upfront loaded. So the developers don't want to be saddled with the liability of trying to manage nature for the next 30 years, which is what the agreements are. They'd rather have somebody else do that for them in some cases. So we can sell those biodiversity units. We then take on the liability of managing that habitat, and they kind of pay for that upfront. The difficulty we have there is that obviously it's a 30-year agreement, upfront money, and we've got 8% inflation. So a pound today is not worth a pound in 30 years. So we need to find a model where we can kind of pool that money. The landowners can generate a kind of a gentle return, which pays as well, or if not slightly better than the opportunity cost. But we can find a way to kind of grow that pot and overcome the inflationary effects in the process.
Fabulous. And there's a question.
I can see Rupert's question as well about so, and that's another great question. So I think what Rupert's saying there is that going from arable to lowland meadow is a big shift, and he's quite right. Creating some of these high distinctiveness habitats is not easy. And actually, if you break this down and look at how UK Hab works, it's based on the very best examples of the selected habitats and their conditions. So when they went out and did the benchmark for what a lowland meadow is, they would have used a pristine lowland meadow that's probably never seen a plough in 300 years. Actually, nobody's ever taken an arable field to that condition of lowland meadow, and we're not 100% sure that it can be done. So there's two answers to this question. One is we can aim for lowland meadow in the hope that we can get there, and this is quite a managed system. Remember, it's not rewilding. We're using very high distinctiveness, local provenance, hand-collected flower seed, and we're managing it in the way that we think is right, and we're getting advice in that process. It doesn't mean we're working with nature. It doesn't mean that we'll get to those conditions and those habitat types. So we can either sell that as a lower habitat. So we could aim for lowland meadow, but actually sell it as neutral grassland, which is a kind of a notch down. And then if it comes to lowland meadow over time, we could, after the 30-year process, we could then look to sell again. So that's one way you can do it. There's also kind of conversations going on with Natural England about adaptive management, and we're not 100% sure on the rules of the game. But to answer Rupert directly, we have sold some units recently, and we actually sold that within a piece of land which we are managing to become lowland meadow, but we actually sold them as neutral grassland because we weren't 100% confident that we can get there. And I think as you go forward and you become more au fait with the process, then you can maybe shift that a little bit. And we've got parcels of land, particularly on some of the slightly heavier land, that didn't suffer quite as badly with last year's drought, that we're more confident we'll get to lowland meadow. And we've got other parcels that we're not 100% sure about because they're very light, and actually it's really difficult to establish these grasslands within these droughts that we keep getting.
Let's take a more risk-averse approach, and then there's still a question mark around what if you end up exceeding what you've sold in terms of the valuation.
Yeah, I think you're better to aim high, but sell low, if that makes sense. Yeah. So you're not overstretching yourself.
But what does happen if you sell something which can't be created in the end?
Well, you're monitored for that, and there will be responsible bodies looking at that. So ultimately, there will be penalties for that if you don't hit the target conditions within the allotted times, and that's why it's not rewilding. It has to be highly managed because we're really looking to deliver that over a period of time. But I think people need to go into this with their eyes wide open that this isn't agri-environment. You don't phone up a local seed company and get an agri-mix seed and shove it in and walk away. It's all about the management to try and deliver the condition of and the types of habitats that we're looking for. These are, you're being paid to deliver something special for nature, and you need to actually deliver that.
Right. Let's move on to the last one, which was neutrality. And I'm guessing some people would have heard of it, and particularly developers where they're trying to build houses in those areas as well. And some of the local authorities in the UK will also be quite au fait as well. But let's just take it back to raw basics here. What is nutrient neutrality? And then how does it work? What's the contract which you're being paid for?
Okay, and it differs slightly from Biodiversity Net Gain, which has been a very conscious policy. It's been 4 or 5 years in the making. It's got a really robust metric with it. We know what we're doing. It's been well rolled out. It's well managed and governed and everything. Nutrient neutrality, by contrast, goes back to a Dutch court case where the Dutch government actually lost a case where they were having an adverse impact on a protected site through some development, and they lost that case, and it set a law, or it set a precedent within law which affects the UK because we're bound by the HABS directive as well. So at that point, there was a kind of a guillotine effect on development that was affecting SACs within England. And in our case in Norfolk, the SACs that are affected are the River Wensum and the Broads. And it's more to do with where you're getting adverse effects of water quality through development. So the premise is that if you're creating overnight accommodation and increasing the amount of people and the amount of sewage going into the system, and that's having a negative impact on those protected sites through additional nutrient load within the water. And that generally boils down to phosphorus and nitrates. And they affect different areas differently because of whatever the designations are within the SAC. So in the Wensum, it's phosphorus. Within the Broads, it's nitrates. But because the Wensum flows into the Broads anyway, we actually get nipped with both in this area. So developers have a real challenge there, and it's taken about a year to try and get our head around what the interventions are. So the developers at this point are having to offset the nutrient load, and generally through buying nutrient credits. And nitrates are relatively easy to deal with within the nature-based solutions arena, because land is relatively efficient at removing nitrates or stopping nitrates getting into the system. Phosphorus is much more of a challenge. You can only remove very, very small amounts of phosphorus through the different interventions. So it's taken us a while, but there are a number of interventions now coming on stream, and Natural England have been working tirelessly to deliver these and approve what these interventions are. So we now have wetlands so this is the principle of integrated constructed wetlands. They can be online or offline. So they can be online is where you're taking the water that's gone through a water recycling centre, or in old money, a sewage works, and polishing that water before it goes back into the watercourse. And the water companies aren't actually immune from this policy either. So they're having to create what they call technical achievable limits by 2030, where the bigger water recycling centres are having to put in infrastructure to remove some of the nutrients to get it down to the best possible water quality that can be achieved with the technology that's available today. So we can do wetlands, and these are kind of a reed bed system. I get told off by the Rivers Trust for saying that, but it's plant assemblages which are removing nutrients through the process, and they're quite effective. So there's a wetland guide. We know roughly what they will remove, and we can create these. They take a while to create because we're going through planning and permitting and trying to get these, lots of modelling to make sure they're in the right place. You've also got interventions like repairing buffers. So particularly for phosphorus, which tends to bind to soil particles and move across the landscape, we can stop some of that sediment getting into the watercourses through woodland planting or grass buffers, and they're quite effective. So some of the intelligence is coming out on exactly what kind of amounts of nutrient they will remove. We can take land out of production because actually farming actually puts its fair share of nutrient into the river. The watercourses. There's another argument as to whether that's fair to developers, as to why should a farmer have the opportunity to monetize that when they're creating part of the problem as well. But when you boil it all down, ultimately we're trying to protect the rivers. The River Wensum is a chalk stream. There's only 200 chalk streams in the world. 85% of those are in the UK. It's a really rare habitat type. The Wensum is in a terrible state. So we do, this is a genuine problem. We do need to take this seriously and do whatever we can. And we're looking at sort of various other interventions across the board, things like replacing septic tanks across multiple properties. That has a kind of a big beneficial effect on the nutrient loads as well. So as we do this and as we get our heads around this, that gives us the ability to generate nutrient credits, which again we can sell to developers and sort of the private sector, which ultimately is investing back into nature. So we're leveraging private finance for nature-based solutions, which is investing in the natural environment.
Perfect. I'm going to move on to our final question, just so we've got time for a few questions. But obviously, we've spoken a little bit about food, and it's a bit of a special case here at Wendley Beck. But what's your vision? If you could design what the perfect system would be, what's the vision of what you could do with? I know in the past when we've been speaking, you've been talking about getting the balance right with food production as well. But what's clearly food production is going down, carbon's going up, biodiversity is going up, nutrient neutrality is going up here as well. What would be the perfect answer here?
Well, we'd love to deliver this project. We're confident that we will deliver it within the next 5 to 10 years, and all of this will go into habitat creation. As we look at that long-term business model, once you get past year 30, it becomes a little bit less certain. So there's safety factors that we're putting in the finance model to deal with that. But we're looking at what those long-term revenue streams could be. So ecotourism starts to come into that. If you build a big space for nature, people might want to come and see it. We've got a farm shop and cafe just going through design stage at the moment to actually, allow some of that produce to come out in a much more localized context. We'd love to have a vertical farm, so controlled environment farming, as they're now calling it. That really does have the ability to be very efficient in the way that we create food. So we've got one in Norfolk at Honningham, which is I think it's the biggest vertical farm in Europe. They've just done their first successful wheat trials in there. So, we will get to the point where we are starting to grow conventional cereal crops in controlled environment farming. 5 crops a year, completely net zero, 90% less water, completely organic. The farm there can do about 7 tons of rocket a day. So they're doing salads and stuff at the moment, but they will get to the point where they're doing cereals. So that's, in our view, it's not going to take away the need for farming, but it will help rebalance this system. And if we can do that, it's hugely efficient. So the one up at Honningham in Norfolk can deliver 1,000 acres worth of conventional agriculture on a 2-acre site. So that, it's completely net zero in the process. So that's quite cool. If we could have a smaller version of that on site here to give us some of the food back, that would be our utopia scenario.
Fantastic. Thank you, Glenn. And what I'm taking away from this conversation is balance. I mean, you've mentioned that in terms of land use and conservation. You've mentioned selecting effectively what habitats to change with different types of schemes and prioritising. Is it biodiversity? Is it carbon? Is it nutrient neutrality? Stacking shouldn't be just seen as it can't be done. Actually, it's just thinking of it in a different way, stacking with food with carbon or food with biodiversity, or indeed nutrient neutrality and biodiversity as well. So it can be done. It's just, you're just going to be a little bit more clever at how we think about it. Finally, economics have to be attractive. That's got to be the thing which kicks in. And the scale and building something better for conservation. But ultimately, what you're also doing here is building something for local people as well. I mean, we've not really said anything about that, but as you said, you touched on at the very end, there is, you're creating something which is, largely speaking, open to the public, right? This is walkway systems, cycle routes. This is something which will bring people back into nature as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's pick up 1 or 2 questions. We are running a little bit on time now. So are we holding back some land for future BNG developments? The baseline figures, if you're too low, I think we're coming back to that. What happens if you don't quite achieve it? Is there a fallback plan just in case? Is that?
Yeah, so I think we're not necessarily holding back land. We're looking to create the habitat up front. So within the biodiversity metric is relatively complex beast. Within there are some multipliers which give us opportunities to be more efficient. And one of those is a temporal multiplier. So if we actually create the habitat up front before we sell it, then the metric deems that there's less risk of failure, and it rewards you for that by an uplift in the metric. So that's what we're doing as our business model. Is we're already creating this stuff on the ground. We'll continue to do that, and we'll look to have different habitat types in the ground for 2, 3, 4, maybe even longer years before we sell it. So that's how we're overcoming that particular point.
And let's turn to some of the ones we had at the beginning, where projects have limited ecological presence to begin with, and biodiversity net gain be achieved through habitat creation. I think the answer to that is yes, but is there something more around being selective as to, I think you described it as in your example of, zero crops have a pretty low score to start with. So actually it is the uplift value, the potential there from going from an arable crop to, if it's possible doing a lowland meadow. It might take a long time, but there's a huge uplift in terms of value.
There is, but you need to be, within farming, we're constantly working against nature. That's what farming does, because, that isn't the natural state, is not a wheat crop or whatever. So we want to try and work with nature as much as we can, because that makes our life easier as much as anything. But we are controlling these environments to a point. So to do that, we need to look at historical baselines. We need to look at soil indices. There's a whole set of data and modeling. So we've got a really comprehensive set of spatial maps now that have tons of information, including all of the historic maps within there. So we've got the original OS, 1813 OS, first edition OS maps vectorized within our spatial data set, that we can go back and look at stuff on the ground as to what it used to be. And that's really important. So where we're putting heath, we know it used to be heath. We know it will probably want to go back to heath because of some of the signs that we're seeing in the hedgerows and the grass margins that haven't been in arable. It might be that we need to nutrient strip it for a few years before we can get the right soil conditions to allow that to happen. And the same, we've always been unfortunate from a farming perspective that we've been on really poor land. Actually, poor land is great from a wildflower perspective, because wildflowers like those kind of poor soil conditions. We also have a pretty broad range of soil types here. So we've got a little bit of heavy land, we've got calcareous grass, we've got acid grass, heath, different opportunities, floodplains, space for water meadows. We can really start to have fun with what nature might want to do and create this kind of dynamic kind of mosaic of different habitat types within there.
Okay. I don't know if there is an answer to this one, but is the funding available for collaborative working?
Well, I think there probably is, in the form of ELM. So, if you look at landscape recovery, which is the top tier of ELM, that's exactly what that's for. So about £750,000 per project, anything over 500 hectares now, there's no upper limit. And that's seeing some real ambition. I'm aware of some of the projects that are out there. There are some incredible projects coming in 2023, 24, which is round 2. There were some incredible round 1 projects that were already looking at mobilizing this stuff. So that's where that collaboration happens. You've also got things like the NERF, which is a Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, that will help fund, startup collaborations for investing in the natural environment. So yeah, there is funding out there. There's species recovery funding. There was another one announced yesterday. You've got the Big Nature Impact Fund, which is quite a big pot of money, Federated Hermes and Finance Earth. That's worth a look at if you go on the Finance Earth website. You've got the Green Finance Institute pulling together lots of information. If you go on their website, there's a toolkit on there to help other landowners start to think about this and build a kind of a process flow. So as we're getting further down the line, we're feeding all of our information back into these organisations as well, and just generally trying to help other people in the process.
Well, I think we've answered what are the key drivers of BNG in the UK, but anything specific to the water industry, which I'm not quite sure if that's the third question to yourself, Glenn, but I think that's more about
so there's loads of opportunities for the water industry for nature-based solutions. They are constricted somewhat from Ofwat. But I think Ofwat are now adjusting their delivery to allow for nature-based solutions as well. We've got technical achievable limits. Nutrient neutrality is obviously putting quite a lot of pressure on them around here. But generally speaking, I think the water industry are under quite a lot of pressure at the moment. You're seeing what's happening with Thames Water, etc. So, yeah, there is a huge amount of opportunities for the water industry for nature-based solutions. And the benefit of nature-based solutions is you're not pouring concrete, which is, then got a carbon offset problem in the future. And you're not locked into in perpetuity chemical dosing through grey infrastructure. So, Anglian Water, who we're working with, are really up on nature-based solutions. They're really trying to drive them forward and link that into their entire supply chain as well.
Fabulous. And last question, if we can, which is, what are the most effective ways local authorities could engage the farming community to help achieve, in this case, carbon neutral targets, but I imagine it's also biodiversity targets as well?
Yeah, biodiversity, all of them. So there's some great models out there. I know South Downs are being extremely proactive as an LPA on engaging with landowners and rolling out some of the architecture, the legal agreements on this, broad overarching Section 106 agreements that allow landowners to draw down units over time rather than a separate agreement for each one. So I would say to the LPAs, you guys need to talk to each other, and there are some really proactive people out there. Warwickshire have always been, super proactive on BNG. There's some great examples in place already. So the more the LPAs and the local authorities can collaborate, the better.
Thank you, Glenn. And that takes us to the top of the hour as well. So I just wanted to say a great thank you to Glenn for joining us today. We'll call it a day for this episode of Sustainable Superheroes. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks everybody for joining. Great stuff.